I claimed I was a victim, but I've been secretly planning to run away with my ex during a solar eclipse in Africa, and you can roll your eyes if you want. Believe me, mine got a full workout when I heard myself say it out loud the first time. But I'm Zara, I'm 30, and I coordinate supply chains for a medical NGO, which means I can make antibiotics cross 3 borders in a week, and I can also make my own lies arrive exactly when they need to, wrapped in tracking numbers and perfectly labeled boxes. The victim part started small, like mold on a forgotten lemon in the fridge, a gray fleck of story that felt easier to live with than the raw green truth. A friend asked why I looked wrung out, and I said Marcus, my husband, had been on my case again. I let the words do that heavy, ambiguous thing. Maybe he was controlling, maybe I was burdened, maybe I was so very brave. The thing is, Marcus is an engineer who measures twice and cuts once and says sorry with T. He's a lot of solid. He's not a tyrant. But telling people I was tired because I was quietly detonating our life to meet my ex 7,000 miles away under a blackened sun sounded messy. So the lemon spot spread. When you manage logistics for a living, you learn the religion of timing. There's this calendar in my brain where every date sits in its tiny square like a passenger at a bus stop, and if you know which bus is coming, if you know the route, you can make impossible things look like coincidence. A total solar eclipse was due to cut a swath across southern Africa in late summer, a corridor of shadow you could drive along like a sentence. Our NGO was already planning a vaccination run in Namibia and northern Botswana, because when people travel to chase the sky, they bring money, yes, but they also bring measles and pertussis, and small clinics get overwhelmed and short on everything from syringes to the patients you need to tell a crying 4-year-old to hold still. Could you lead the supply rehearsal in Windhoek? My director asked, pushing her glasses up with the back of her wrist the way she does when she's 3 coffees deep and pretending not to be human. You're the only one who can troubleshoot that warehouse. It's a mess. I nodded, and inside my chest a door I hadn't looked at in 2 years swung open. Kai was the ex-Kai with the slanted grin that always looked like a dare you probably should take. Kai who made documentaries the way other people make excuses, constantly and with the right lighting. We were together for 5 years, long enough to learn each other's grocery lists and laugh breaths and Achilles' heels. Not long enough to survive the moment he turned a job offer in Cape Town into our next chapter without asking if my chapter included uprooting my work, leaving my mother to her tea tins and her garden, and learning to love a kind of loneliness you can hear. I said no. He went. He called from different latitudes for a while, and then his voice became a rumor. Then nothing. I met Marcus at a training on cold chain logistics, nothing sexier than the phrase temperature monitoring, and he told me he liked how I made chaos feel solvable. We got engaged a year later because that felt like the kind of sentence you finish once you start it. And then Kai texted me at 3:11 a.m. one May morning a year into my marriage. If you ever wanted the universe to tap you on the shoulder, it's about to, he wrote. Totality. Namibia. Come watch the sun unmake itself with me. I lay next to Marcus in the dark and watched the 3 dots dance then die. My heart did that wet dog shake where it throws off everything that isn't today. I texted back, that's dramatic even for you. He replied with a pin on a map. Somewhere northwest of Windhoek, near a salt pan that glowed white even on the satellite image, a gravel road scratched across the earth like a scab you shouldn't pick. Coordinates are jokes for people like me. The punchline is the fact that I always know where I am. It turns out planning an escape is not that different from planning a surgical glove shipment. You need redundancies. You need cover stories that align with other people's calendars. You need cash in 3 currencies and a list of who asks questions and who never does. I built it in layers. Work sent me first, site visits, temperature data loggers to place, trainings to give to local nurses who already knew everything but had to listen to me because hierarchy is a disease. Then came the personal itinerary I did not add to the shared family calendar, an overnight permit for a conservation area, a reservation that wasn't in my name at a lodge that didn't exactly exist unless you knew who to ask, a 2-day gap no one in London would blink at because travel in the bush eats time without apologizing. And at the center of it, 2 minutes and 7 seconds of totality, a hole in the day perfectly shaped like a new story. I feel like a cardboard cutout at home, I heard myself say to my friend Nora over coffee, because justification likes an audience. Marcus means well, but he likes knowing where I am. You run medical supply chains in places with goat detours and one road, she said. I like knowing where you are too. I smiled the villain's smile. It looks exactly like the brave girl's smile if you squint. You know what I mean, I said, and Nora, who loves me enough to call my bluff, squeezed my wrist and went quiet. The weeks slid into the groove I carved for them. I trained, I packed, I kissed Marcus goodbye with the soft mouth of a person who learned how to perform domestic sincerity, and I flew. Windhoek always smells like dust and citrus when you step off the plane. Even the baggage carousel looks like it wants to tell you the truth. I checked into the NGO's guest house, slept for 3 hours because jet lag has its own charter, and walked to the warehouse to introduce myself to chaos. It recognized me. The afternoon heat made everything stick to everything. I ticked boxes and counted coolers and sweet-talked a forklift with a broken horn. I rolled a pallet jack like I was born with it. At dusk, the local team, legendary nurses with the patience of Riverstones, arrived for the briefing, and we did the dance. Here's the route, here's the backup route, here's who to text when the backup also breaks. When it was done, I set the small blue cooler with the delicate temperature monitor, my excuse, just so on the table. To anyone watching, I was a woman watching a number hold steady between two parameters. Inside, a diagnosis was already forming that would take me all night to translate into action. Kai. I texted when the cricket started and the sky decided to wear every version of purple at once. He sent a photo, a horizon wide enough to smudge your mouth, a road lonely in the beautiful way, and his boots dusty, familiar. Camped by the pan, he wrote. There's a jackal who thinks he can negotiate. I stood on the guesthouse porch with the lizard shadow of a gecko holding the corner of the wall, and I took a long breath like responsibility and discomfort toothbrush share in this body. Tomorrow, I typed. The word did the thing words do. It made a next step even if I didn't deserve it. I could give you a montage of drives and checkpoints and tea brewed where you'd swear water was just an idea, but let me skip to the part where I left the convoy at a crossroads the way we planned. We'll meet you by noon at the clinic, I told Lazetti, the head nurse, in a tone that sounded like it's all under control even though control is a sandcastle here and the tide is unreliable. She eyed me with the raised brow kindness of a woman who can already see through your bones. Don't fall in love with the scenery, she said. It won't text you back. The track to the salt pan was more suggestion than road. The air thinned. The sun wrote its initials on my neck. And then the world opened and there it was, a pale, flat ocean that once had water and now held sky for ransom. There were flamingos at the far edge like a rumor. They lifted all at once and became punctuation. Kai stepped out from behind the backy with that grin that still knew my passwords. You made it, he said, which is such a small way to name a betrayal delivered in so many careful parts. I had work, I said, which was also true, and then we were hugging in knot, our arms doing the math of how much this meant and how much we were willing to pay. He looked older in the way that makes a mouth kinder. There was more map to his face. Less trying. He had a streak of white in his hair that looked like honesty. I brought you something, he said, pulling a canvas bag from the truck like a magician who knows better than to do the hat routine. Inside, an eclipse filter for a camera, a battered field notebook, and a blue scarf as thin as an apology. You still overdo it, I said, half smiling, fully drowning. You still pretend you prefer simple, he answered, and that, reader, is where you're supposed to throw your hands up and say, they deserve each other. Maybe we do. Maybe we don't. Maybe deserving is the wrong equation. We set up camp with the practiced silences of people who survived 5 years of knowing what the other needed before the sentence finished. He unrolled the tent, I checked the stove. He tied down the corner, I pretended the wind hadn't just said my name. The sky did its pre-eclipse cleanliness, washed, generous, oblivious to the human choreography below. He talked about the documentary he was filming, migratory routes, local guides, the way tourists write their gaze on places. I talked about vaccine hesitancy and how stories travel faster than viruses, how sometimes they bring them. We were both performance and confession. When the sun began to tilt toward the idea of hiding, the air took on that anticipatory hush, the way a room quiets when a speech is about to matter. Shadow blunted the edges of things. Colors looked newly invented. Birds argued in lower registers. Kai stood next to me and I felt the gravity of every version of our story settle into my feet. "Run away with me," he said, just like that, as if the words weren't a cliché and an insult and my favorite song. "To where?" I asked, because my brain speaks in coordinates when my heart would rather run traffic lights. Like, literally. "We follow the shadow. East, up through the Caprivi, cross into Zambia if we have to. I already cleared it with a friend. Then north. A flight from Lusaka to wherever you're brave enough to admit you want." You make it sound like moving a chess piece. You've always been my endgame. The last sliver of sun bit its lip and then let go. Totality happened like an intake of breath the size of a continent. The sky went black, the world went blue, the horizon burned a ring of unexpected oranges like someone lit 360 degrees of sunset at once. The temperature dropped and the hair on my arms practiced disbelief. People who have watched a total solar eclipse will tell you you're not the same after. They're right, but the difference isn't mystical. It's practical. You realize how much you've been tolerating glare. I looked up at the ring, dark moon, burning crown, and inside my body where the calendars hum and the spreadsheets take attendance, something unclenched. Not because I understood fate. Because I understood scale. "I can't be a victim if I'm the architect," I said into the dark noon, the sentence I had been building taxes to all these weeks. I told people I was trapped so I wouldn't have to say I wanted. Wanting is loud. It's selfish. It's also a compass. The words made the air around my face cold. They made Kai close his eyes like he'd been waiting for them but didn't know it. "I don't need you to be rescued," he said softly. "I need you to choose." "I did," I said, and the black ring overhead flickered a bead of careful light at its edge, the famous diamond the sky briefly tries on before it remembers who it is. "I chose chaos that helps people. I chose a man who is kind. And now I've chosen to stop lying to everyone, including myself." "Which choice is that?" he asked, a little smile in the question because he already knew enough to know this wasn't going to be neat. "I'm not running," I said, and it surprised me how quickly my mouth made peace with it. "Not with you. Not from Marcus. After this, I'm going to drive back to the clinic and count syringes and refill coolers and hug Leslie because she sees through me and loves me anyway. And then I'm going to call Marcus and tell him everything. If he wants to leave, I'll let him leave without begging for praise for my honesty. If he wants counseling, I'll go. If he throws the monster off the balcony, I'll pick it up and repot it. But I'm not practicing evasion as a hobby anymore." The daylight returned like a thing the world had every right to keep from us. We squinted together and didn't speak and listened to insects hitting the play button on their small songs again. When sound came back, it felt earned. Kai nodded, a long exhale disguised as movement. "I half expected that," he said. "I brought an extra passport photo for you anyway." He handed it to me. I laughed, and the laugh hurt the way smiling through a stitch does. I slipped the photo into the field notebook because not all relics belong in the bin. We broke camp with the borrowed solemnity of people who got what they came for even if it wasn't what they thought. He drove me to the crossroads. We didn't kiss. We held hands, and it felt like proof that we were not saints. Then he turned left and I turned right, and the dust we made was separate and the same. At the clinic, a queue had knitted itself into patience. Mothers with babies hooked to their chests by colorful slings. Old men wearing hats that remembered older sons. Leslie handed me a clipboard without looking up and then flicked her eyes at my face and smiled with all the corners. "You look like someone got their horoscope read by science," she said, and I said something like that, and we went back to work. That night on the guesthouse porch, I called Marcus. The crickets had switched keys. The gecko was at its post. "I have to tell you something," I said, and then I told him the long version, the embarrassing version, the one where the pacing is bad and you keep stopping to say you're sorry not because it undoes anything but because saying it out loud ties it to your mouth forever and you'll taste it each time you think about cheating with silence again. He didn't speak for a while. I messed with the elastic of the blue scarf and thought about people who think forgiveness is a currency. "Thank you for not letting me find out from anyone else," he said finally. Do you want to stay married? I want to stop using you as an alibi, I said. If that costs the marriage, I'll pay it. I love you. I don't know if I love you the way I promised to love you. I want to find out. With a grown-up in the room. I'll be home Sunday, he said, voice steady in the way that made me fall for him first, that quiet competence that never once asked me to be smaller. We'll decide what a grown-up looks like. The next morning I woke to some small mean thought trying to revive itself. You should have run. It would have been easier, but it died when I thought about Lacidi's raised brow and the way the eclipse taught me that the loudest thing doesn't deserve the most attention. I rolled the cooler out to the truck. I wrangled the pallets. I watched the number on the temperature logger hold steady like a promise. I sent a photo of the sunrise to no one in particular and then to everyone, my mother, my team, Nora, and yes, Marcus. The caption, back to work. Which is the other name for contrition. On my last evening in Windhoek, I went to a small restaurant where the tables were too close and the food tasted like someone's cousin told you what to order. The owner had a TV on quietly in the corner replaying footage of the eclipse. Strangers in different countries cried under the same borrowed night. A kid with a cardboard viewer hugged a stranger's waist. The camera cut to a scientist looking wrecked with joy. The subtitle said, "We chase shadows to learn light." When I got home, Marcus and I did not manage Grace on the first try. Or the second. We put our rings in a small ceramic dish that said keys and looked at each other like people who bought a house without reading the inspection report. But we went to counseling, and when I used the word victim, the therapist tilted her head and said, "What do you think you had to be a victim of to deserve your choices?" I stared at my knees for a long time and then said, "The part of me that wanted." We practiced letting the wanting stand up without us needing to hand it a passport and a pistol. We learned to say, "I'm jealous of your ease in the world," instead of "you're controlling." Sometimes at night he'd ask me to tell him the eclipse story again, and I'd watch his chest rise and fall while I described shadows learning choreography and birds complaining at the wrong noon. Kai sent one more text months later, a photo of a little girl at a clinic near Kisangani holding a vaccination card and scowling in a way that could run a small country. She cried for 6 seconds, then demanded a sticker, he wrote. Thought you'd like her style. I hearted it. I told Marcus. We were, improbably, managing the small, sturdy miracle of being boringly honest. If you're looking for the grand romantic betrayal where I step onto a plane with a duffel of cash and disappear under a black sun with a man who knows my worst angles, I'm sorry to disappoint you. That door stays with its hinges on. I am not a victim. I am not a heroine either. I am a woman whose job is to keep delicate things safe in hostile conditions, who finally realize that includes my own story. I keep a map of the eclipse path tacked above my desk now, not as a shrine but as a diagram. Look, the world lets its brightest thing hide sometimes and doesn't apologize, and we don't set anything on fire. We stand quietly. We notice the ring. We let what we chose to put in the shadow be honest there. And then the light returns and the work continues, which is not less holy for being ordinary.